I think that what we have here is a situation where there are some class differences among Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican populations that are long-standing. The Cuban population received more federal aid through the Cuban refugee program than any other minority has ever received in the history of the United States. Between 1966 and 1974 alone, $240 million. By the time you hit the early 80s, when it ended, close to $2 billion was spent aiding Cubans in South Florida in particular. Not really anywhere else, but in South Florida in particular, with things that Latinos had been fighting for decades. So one of them is bilingual education. Puerto Ricans had lived in the Northeast for a longer period of time than the Cubans when they began to arrive in large numbers. And Puerto Ricans have been fighting for bilingual education, respect for Spanish-speaking students for decades. I mean, to give you a sense for where the outrage over that comes from. In the 1940s, it was typical practice. In the 1930s, it was typical practice that Puerto Rican children would be automatically put into classes for the mentally retarded, simply because, by New York City's public schools, simply because they didn't speak English. And so this meant that, this community had been at a great deficit for years in terms of what was available to them, resources and otherwise, from the federal government and from local governments. And Cubans, because frankly it was beneficial to U.S. Cold War policy to make sure they succeeded, they got a kind of federally subsidized American dream that we all should have gotten. I mean, frankly, in many respects, all minorities needed, in moments in the last century in particular, aid and help and opportunities to correct the wrongs of the past. So that's one of the reasons that there has always been a kind of divide, I think in particular between Cubans and Puerto Ricans, because there is a lack of knowledge on the part of Cubans as to their degree of help, their degree of sponsorship. There is a certain degree of denial among the leadership of the exile community who like to say that we just did it all by ourselves and we're self-made, and none of that is true. Some of it is true on an individual level, but collectively we have to be grateful for the kinds of support that we got and that we continue to get. I mean, I think one last thing to note is that since 1966, Cubans can seek asylum in the United States without having to prove anything. And as long as you arrive, in the United States, now you have to actually arrive on land as of 1994. But the Cuban Adjustment Act gives Cubans from the island an automatic residency status in the United States. They don't have some kind of a hearing. They don't have their motives for being here are not questioned, and they are not considered primarily economic, even though that is the reason that most people have come at least since the 1990s here. And all you have to do is ask them. But nonetheless, the law remains the same, and this is another source of resentment among other groups, and I think it's a valid source. Mexicans, Dominicans, Haitians have to fight to get here, but groups in particular like Haitians or Salvadorans or Guatemalans who were fleeing state terror in the 1980s, they, in their vast majority, were either deported or they have spent years trying to legalize their status because they came here undocumented and were effectively seen by the U.S. government as economic refugees when that was the last thing they were.